Spiritual Psychology and Theosophy's Role in Creating It, presented by Dr. Lisa Love. So I'd like to begin this presentation by getting an understanding of the origin of the name psychology. The word psychology derives from the Greek root psyche, which means breath, spirit, or soul, and the Greek root of logia, which means the study of. Therefore, psychology, when the word is rightfully used, means the study of the soul. I think that's important because, as we will see, psychology has branched off into two different directions, and one branch denies the existence of the soul altogether. And it's my argument then that they should be using a different name than the name psychology. Now, psychology then, rightfully in its study of the soul, borrows a lot from different spiritual traditions that have attempted to understand what the soul is and how it develops. And it's no coincidence then that those of us interested in the true psychology, the true study of the soul, often attempt to try and understand what different religions have to say about the soul. To let you know, the Latin word psychologia showed up in a book by Marco Moralic titled The Psicologia di Rational Anima Humanae in the late 1400s to early 1500s. And that's the first time that we've seen the word psychology actually being used. Before that, we know that the word was borrowed from these Greek roots, but we don't see the actual word psychology showing up until the 1400s to early 1500s in this book. We also find it in Englishman Stephen Blanckart's book, The Physical Dictionary, in 1694, where he mentions anatomy, which treats the body, and psychology, which treats of the soul. And the source for that information I got from Wikipedia. If that is accurate, that's left to be truly discerned. So we see that even though the word psychology was being used some time ago, the modern day psychology, especially spiritual psychology, actually came into being more around the arrival of Helena P. Blavatsky and the emergence of the Theosophical movement. Now, Blavatsky was born August 12, 1831 and crossed over May 8, 1891, and Theosophy is a word which means Sophia, wisdom of Theos, God. So Theosophy is basically trying to understand the wisdom of God. It was founded in 1875 and Blavatsky was considered the main scholarly author. Now, Theosophy provided a synthesis of Eastern and Western spirituality, borrowing from metaphysical traditions, esoteric traditions, which were the secret or hidden teachings at that time. Many of those teachings are no longer esoteric, no longer hidden, as well as from an understanding of what comparative religions had to say about soul and spirit. Theosophy also showed an interest in researching the soul and psychic phenomena. And it introduced the theosophical model towards spiritual evolution. And we see in this model, which we are not going to get into in detail in this video, that's not the purpose of this video, but we see the word soul there used both as a spiritual and human soul and as the animal soul. Theosophy also introduced to Western intelligentsia the notion of root races, or how human consciousness evolves over very long periods of time. And in sharing these different races, which is a word I don't particularly care for, I would prefer to use the word levels of consciousness. But anyway, the early Theosophical movement used the word races. We see that human evolution is eventually moving towards a more spiritualized way of being. Now, since doing this original presentation, I have discovered that a lot of this information on the root races actually also was borrowed from the Purans out of Hinduism. The Purans are ancient stories that are thousands of years old, some say 10,000 or more years old, that talk about the evolution of human consciousness through time as well. Now let's look at some of the founders of the recognized modern-day field of psychology. And remember, I've said that Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement have had a direct influence on it, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. But right now I want to introduce you to three key figures. One is William James. 1876 is when he started to make his impact on the field of psychology. Notice that that's only a year after the Theosophical movement was founded in 1875. And shortly after William James, we're going to see the emergence of Wilhelm Wundt in 1879. And then we're also going to see, not too long after that, a name more of you are probably familiar with, Sigmund Freud, 1886. Now, what you're going to see is that already early on, the field of psychology is splitting into two directions. One, which William James founded, is evolutionary psychology, which emphasizes the value and role of the soul. The other, by Wilhelm Wundt, is experimental psychology, which is already denying the existence of the soul. So we see, as this new field emerges, already the split between the soul being real and the soul being said to not exist is emerging. And then we have Sigmund Freud, which started his famous field of psychoanalysis. Let's take some time to look more in depth at these three people and how they shaped the psychology field to come. So let's start with William James, who was considered to be the father of psychology. Born January 11th, 1842, crossed over August 26, 1910. He was born into a wealthy family, and he was the son of a Swedenborgian theologian. Now, to let you know, you're going to see some of the text in this presentation emphasized in blue. That is to show you the psychological threads, and you'll see some of it in yellow. That's to show the theosophical or ageless wisdom tie-ins. Now, James trained as a physician at Harvard. You will see Harvard is an important school in the emergence of the field of psychology, especially spiritual psychology. So James was trained there, and he started Harvard in 1864, but he never practiced medicine. And he remained, however, at Harvard between 1873 to 1907, teaching anatomy at first, but then in 1876 he switched to teaching philosophy and then psychology, which were his main interest. Now, part of that is because he had already started to be influenced by the Theosophical Society and its philosophical and psychological ideas. But James did not officially become a member of the Theosophical Society until 1882. He also joined the American Society for Psychical Research, which was an offshoot of the Theosophical Society's Society for Psychical Research, when the American version was established by Sir William Fletcher Barrett in December of 1884. So already we're seeing how the father of psychology was directly tied in with Theosophy. Now, among James' most influential books, we have The Principles of Psychology, which was published in 1890, which was considered to be a groundbreaking text in the field of psychology. And we also have The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1901 to 1902. And it's interesting because at this time, James, who was studying mystical experiences, which many mystics have from different comparative religious backgrounds and also in terms of their psychical visions, etc., James divided these mystical experiences into two kinds. One, mystical experiences that uplift the personality from the everyday realm into the realm of the divine, and two, those that led to insanity. Later we see this in terms of the idea of spiritual emergences, where they're emerging into higher spiritual levels, and spiritual emergencies, where they're breaking down and dropping into lower levels of consciousness, or the disintegration of the personality instead of the integration of the personality into soul awareness. James was also interested in introspection, consciousness, and how the environment helps to shape behavior, and as we've already seen, he called his study evolutionary psychology. So what were some of the foundational ideas underlying William James' evolutionary psychology? Well, to begin with, he felt that something is true if it makes sense to the believer, if it accurately describes the world around you and is coherent with your beliefs. So we might say that he felt that truth was relative and that a healthy psychology happened if you used your beliefs to help you adapt to the world around you in a way that makes sense to you and in a way was also helping you to fit into the cultural milieu surrounding you. He also felt that it was essential that God be conceived as the deepest power in the universe and felt that God must be conceived under the form of a mental personality. So what we find then is that God is essential to William James' study of the soul or psychology, and God can either be an abstract idea like a power in the universe, or it can be a mental idea, or it can be anthropomorphized, given human characteristics in order to help us try and understand and relate to God better. He believed that the mind can be used to cure psychological difficulties, and that was emerging in theosophical ideas at the time, and William James helped to expound upon them. And we also see that there were some other people that were emerging at that time, most notably Mary Baker Eddy, July 16, 1821 to December 1910, through her Christian Science movement of using the mind to heal, and later through Ernest Holmes, January 21st, 1887 to April 7th, 1960, in his Science of Mind teachings, which went on to become Christian Science with Mary Baker Eddy and the Church of Religious Science, now called the Centers for Spiritual Living, under the auspices of Ernest Holmes and others like Thomas Troward, etc., who helped shape the Science of Mind movement. A pragmatist, James felt that any truth or underlying meaning of any statement was to be measured by its practical consequences. He wanted people to be able to get along in the world. He felt that psychology had to have practical results in our lives. If we were picking up a psychology of the soul that helped us to be impractical, that was not something that William James felt was serving us very well. And we will see that idea emerge in the teachings of people like Alice Bailey, who we will find later in this presentation, another theosophist that said, quite frankly, that you have to remain grounded, you have to remain practical, you have to be able to still function in the world in your soul psychology as well. James was also known to have an interest in altered states and was known to have experimented with chloral hydrate in 1870, with alkyl nitrate in 1875, and nitrous oxide 1882, and peyote in 1896. Now, you notice that he was already experimenting with altered states before he encountered the Theosophical movement, which started around 1875. So he was already interested in mystical experiences and was inclined to try and understand how different substances could help us obtain these. Finally, here is an understanding of the model of spiritual evolution in psychology that William James put forward. We have a material self, a social self, what he called a pure ego or soul, and spiritual self. Now, you will notice that in both ancient theosophical ideas and in William James' ideas, that the word ego originally meant soul. It did not mean the selfish person or selfish individual the way the word ego means in our modern times. And often in the world of psychology now we have to make a distinction so that when people study how the word used to be used, they do not get confused. And finally, here is how his model compares to the Theosophical model. You see that he was trying to simplify it some more. Now, if you remember early on, I said there was a split in the field of psychology within the first few years between William James and William Wundt. William Wundt was born August 16, 1832 to August 31st, 1920, and he was a German physician, physiologist, philosopher, and professor. And he believed that psychology should be influenced by culture, feelings, volition, and also somewhat by physiology. But it's interesting to note that he was an atheist. He felt there was no such thing as a soul or God. He rejected the idea of an unconscious. And he was predominantly somebody who only believed in the world of the five senses and what the five senses revealed to you, and anything else was just simply nonsense. Now, Wundt wanted psychology to become a science distinct from philosophy or even biology, so he began to perform psychological experiments to prove his ideas. And that is why he is regarded as the father of experimental psychology. Ironically, he was the first person to call himself a psychologist. But I myself find that ironic. I would have preferred that he would have called himself something else since he did not believe in a soul. Maybe he could have called his discipline mindology, or better yet, I think he should have called it behaviorology or something else, since essentially he and his followers removed the word soul from psychology altogether. Now, why they did that? Took a word that essentially means the study of the soul and defamed it, distorted it, instead of coming up with their own word, is to me kind of interesting and an example of a closed mind or fixed idea, which becomes, in my opinion, a problem in the field of psychology overall, especially those that follow the atheistic and materialistic lines later down the road. Now, there were some predominant followers of William Wundt. The first one was John Watson, born January 9, 1878 to September 25, 1958. He also was an atheist, and he says he became an atheist because he rebelled against his hypocritical Baptist minister father and his puritanical mother at a young age. And so he aligned with Wundt's ideas early on. Now, I find this fascinating because that's in modern day psychology what we would call a reaction formation. You're forming a reaction to something that you don't like, instead of being able to have a truly dispassionate and more objective understanding of things. In 1913, Watson rejected William James' ideas in a lecture at Columbia University and redefined psychology as the acquisition of information useful to the control of behavior. Therefore, he established psychology more along behavioral psychology lines. And then we have the most famous behavioral psychologist, B.F. Skinner. Born March 20th, 1904 to August 18th, 1990. Now notice he was just a very small child by the time William James had passed away. And B.F. Skinner later went to Harvard, which is where William James taught. But from 1958 to 1974, he started to debunk the ideas of William James. And instead, also an atheist, he tried to base psychological findings along the ideas of experimental psychology. He was also the first to use animal experimentation. Now, why did B.F. Skinner become an atheist? That's something that I looked up. He says he became an atheist at age 14 because he didn't like the idea of hell. Now, what was interesting to me is that all three of these men, in my personal opinion, had a very primitive understanding of the soul, of God, perhaps very little to no understanding of comparative religions, certainly very little to no understanding of theosophical ideas, because they would not have had such extreme reactions if they'd had a more comprehensive understanding, perhaps, of how the soul and God were viewed in theosophical traditions. But what this all meant is that the field of psychology began to have a materialistic emphasis that has led even today to the view that modern psychology overall sees mystical and religious experiences as pathological. And if you're having any mystical, psychic, or religious experiences, it means that you simply have a chemical imbalance. In fact, if you look at our modern day psychological diagnostic manuals, the DSM-4, you will discover that even though there is a V code trying to insert spirituality in there to some degree, for the most part, if you believe in anything spiritual, or if you are not a materialist or even really an atheist, you are considered psychologically a little bit to a lot pathological in your inclinations. And the modern day drug industry agrees then that you should be primarily treated by medication. So now let's look at the third founder, Sigmund Freud, who was 1856 to 1939, the father of psychoanalysis. He was born to Hasidic Jewish parents in the Moravian town of Friedberg in the Austrian Empire in the country that is now Ukraine. And his family moved to Vienna when he was 6 years old. At age 17, he enrolled in the University of Vienna. He planned to study law, but got interested in philosophy, learning from Franz Brentano, a Catholic priest. And it was interesting to look at this man's life because he had some theosophical type ideas. And Brentano also influenced Rudolf Steiner, a famous theosophist. In 1881, Freud graduated as a neurologist and spent most of his life in Vienna, having set up his clinical practice there in 1886. Shortly before that, in October 1885, Freud had gone to Paris to study with Jean-Martin Charcot, a renowned neurologist, who was conducting scientific research into hypnosis, which was really popular at the time, mesmerism, hypnosis. Freud decided to use hypnosis with his patients, though this later changed, and he started to call it the talking cure. Actually, he didn't originally coin that phrase. His famous patient Anna O did, but essentially Freud noticed that when women, most of his patients were women, some men, that when they talked, that helped them get better more than just hypnosis. Now, we have a lot of research that we've done on men and women. In general, women do feel better when they talk, especially to their fellow female friends who are very good at listening. Men, not so inclined to talk, may not have liked the talking cure as much. I don't know how many male clients he had, but probably not as many. In 1902, he set up the Wednesday Psychological Society after he became a university professor, and we're going to look at these three men next: Alfred Adler, Otto Rank, and Carl Jung. In 1938, Freud left Austria to escape the Nazis and died in exile in the United Kingdom in 1939. So now let's take a look at some of Freud's psychological views. We've already discussed free association, which replaced hypnotherapy, and that was the talking cure. Now we're going to look a little bit at repressed sexuality and the Oedipus complex. Why? Because Freud's major theories were based upon what's known as the seduction theory. And this theory came about when he noticed that most of his clients reported episodes of sexual abuse, mainly between the ages of 4 up to the age of 10, and almost all of his clients were women. And these same women exhibited hysterical emotional reactions and had obsessional thoughts about sex. And at first he thought that these sexual abuse episodes were real and that these hysterical reactions and obsessional thoughts about sex were based upon real sexual abuse episodes. But this is important. In 1897, he abandoned this belief and began to think that all of these episodes were fantasy. Why? Because the perpetrator was always their father. And he felt that, quote, such widespread perversions against children are not very probable, end of quote. And so that led him to believe a couple of things. First of all, the Oedipus complex, that men and women in general, pretty much he made it almost all of us, if not all of us, want to have sex with our parents. Young boys with their mothers, young women with their fathers, and they were fantasizing about sex instead of actually being sexually abused. That also led to another important thing in terms of psychology, or the soul. Belief in a soul, or belief in God, Freud felt was actually based upon infantile sexual repression. You have these sexual mystical kind of urges, and you transfer them onto your parents, or you transfer them onto some sort of god or goddess. And that also led to his understanding of the unconscious, which he felt was incapable of separating fact from fiction, and also as dreams as simply wish fulfillment, revealing your fantasy life. In other words, he changed all of this into fantasy and built his theory upon all of that. Now, I know that when I got out with my master's, my first master's in marriage family therapy in 1980s, I began to specialize in childhood sexual abuse and adolescent sexual abuse. And at that time in the 1980s, statistics showed that 1 out of every 3 women and 1 out of every 5 men were sexually molested or abused by the time they hit their mid-20s. So it's kind of interesting to think how Freud twisted all of this around and twisted psychology around as basically a belief in the soul as infantile sexual repression. Now this is his model: superego, the father, the mother, God, goddess; ego, the healthy self, and the id, the sexually repressed self. This is James' model, and this is Theosophy's model. And what we can see is the kind of squishing down of theosophical ideas into this really simplistic notion. So now we will look at some key people that Freud influenced that also shaped the psychological field, starting with Alfred Adler. February 7, 1870 to May 28, 1937, he was an Austrian medical doctor and founder of the School of Individual Psychology. And he came up with the idea of the inferiority complex. And he shifted psychology mainly to focus on life tasks like occupation, work, society, friendship, love, and sexuality. And if these were fulfilled in a healthy way, you had a healthy human being. If they were not, somebody developed an inferiority complex. Then we have Otto Rank, April 22nd, 1884 to October 31st, 1939. He worked with Freud for 20 years, and he was actually Freud's closest co-worker. Rank focused on birth trauma, an individual's emotional life, which he still felt was mainly influenced by their sexuality. But he did something very important. He got clients to focus more on the here and now, and thought that psychology should mainly be about replacing outworn thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that weren't working with ones that did. And he influenced Erik Erikson, Fritz Perls, Lawrence Kohlberg, Robert Kegan, Jean Piaget, and Rollo May, significant important psychologists, but we are not talking about them in this presentation because they did not have the kind of connections to spiritual psychology we want to emphasize. We will be talking about Stanislav Grof, Robert Fraser, and James Fadiman, who did have that. And we will also be talking more about Carl Jung in just a little bit. But before we look more at Carl Jung, I want to go back and look at Theosophy and what I call the 3 Bs: Blavatsky, Besant, and Bailey. Let's start with Annie Besant. She was born October 1st, 1847 through September 20th, 1933, and she became president of the Theosophical Society in 1890. And along with Charles Ledbetter, she helped further expand upon many of the ideas put forth by the Theosophical Society, including the stages of initiation and what takes place upon a spiritual path, especially as one grows into the higher planes or levels of the Theosophical model. She also helped to make further attempts to investigate what I would call the nature of the soul itself, so that we could better understand what spiritual growth looked like, and she made further advances in training people to use meditation and other spiritual disciplines so that they could become more aware of the realm of the soul or spirit itself. And I'm bringing all of this in because, again, psychology is the study of the soul in its original meaning, and I feel that Besant was helping to look at the soul and how we evolve into recognizing and even we could say becoming the soul. And I also wanted to add the model as she and Ledbetter continued to expand upon it with what we could call the many different lines you see there in terms of the subplanes here in the Theosophical model. Now I'd like to look at Alice Bailey, who was born June 16, 1880 to December 15, 1949, who was the founder of a field that she called esoteric psychology. Now, she was a theosophist who used to reside at Crotona with her husband Foster Bailey. And Alice created a form of evolutionary psychology, which again she called esoteric psychology, using the Theosophical model primarily as put forth by Annie Besant, Charles Ledbetter, and Arthur E. Powell. Alice also spoke about 10 soul groups, 5 major and also 5 subgroups that were connected to the idea of the root races, and as we will see later, sound similar to ideas put forward in our time by the field of integral psychology. Alice developed the idea of people developing according to type. To my knowledge, she's the first one to do this, especially along the lines of the 7 ray types, giving 7 ray types to the soul, the personality, the mind, the emotions, and the body. And to my knowledge, I still have not seen a typology that is as extensive as the one Bailey put out. Now here is that Theosophical model, and here is the version that Alice Bailey put forward. Bailey created a form of evolutionary astrology based upon where people were at spiritually. And she had a direct influence on astrologer Dane Rudhyar, who astrologers voted as one of the most influential astrologers of all time in 2018. And Bailey outlined, especially in her book Esoteric Psychology Volume 2, the psychospiritual problems that people face as they travel on the path of initiation and before, expanding upon the ideas that her predecessors in Theosophy put forth, especially Annie Besant. So why you saw me take a quick break and explain the 3 B's before I went into Carl Jung is because I'm getting ready as I present Carl Jung to make a connection between Jung and Theosophy, especially through Alice Bailey. So Carl Jung was born July 26, 1875 to June 6, 1961, and he was the founder of analytical psychology. He was born in Switzerland, and again, looking at the early spiritual life, his father, Paul Jung, was originally from Germany and was a Protestant pastor of the Swiss Reformed Church, and his mother, Emily Jung, interestingly enough, was often reported to visit nightly with spirits, and Jung even claims to have seen one when he was young. In 1895, he began to study medicine at the University of Basel, and he completed his degree in 1900. And in 1903, his dissertation was published titled On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena. And we want to make a connection here to the varieties of religious experience, where William James was publishing his book just slightly before, dealing with some of the same things. What are the positives and negatives about getting involved with occult phenomena, mystical experiences, and so forth? Interestingly enough, Annie Besant and Alice Bailey had something to say about that. Probably so did Blavatsky. I'm just not as familiar with her writings. In 1906, at age 30, Jung sent his Studies in Word Association to Sigmund Freud in Vienna, and they met for the first time the following year, and Jung recalled that they talked almost unceasingly for 13 hours. 6 months after that, the then 50-year-old Freud sent a collection of his latest published essays to Jung in Zurich. And this marked the beginning of an intense correspondence and collaboration that lasted 6 years. And Freud was so impressed with Jung that he named him the first head of his newly founded International Psychoanalytic Association. But In 1912, this association ended when Jung published his book Psychology of the Unconscious, where Jung was de-emphasizing the importance of sexual development and instead wanted to focus on the collective unconscious, or the part of the unconscious that contains memories and ideas that Jung believed were inherited from our ancestors. Then in 1913, at the age of 38, Jung experienced what he called a horrible confrontation with the unconscious, where he saw visions and heard voices, and he wrote about his experiences in something known as the Red Book, which he worked on for 16 years. Finally published in 2009, it was denounced by critics as, quote, odd and full of antediluvian mystical realities, end of quote. But to let you know, while I was preparing for this talk, I found on YouTube a series of discussions by Theosophist Stephen Haller on the Red Book. I highly recommend it. It was fascinating. So Jung came out of seclusion in 1921 with the publication of his book Psychological Types, which was an attempt to reconcile the theories of Freud and Adler, claiming things look differently depending on whether you focus primarily within the ego and its instinctual nature or with the soul. He also began to argue that no one method works for everyone in treatment. So a couple of things. First of all, you kind of see that William James evolutionary psychology thing emerging a little bit with Carl Jung over the simplistic id, ego, superego model of Freud. And also, Jung is using the word ego the way Freud is using it, and Adler is using it more having to do with what we would call the personality. Also, Psychological Types, I read that book when I was a teenager, and at the time I was also learning astrology. And I thought, well, this is interesting. This book sounds a lot like astrology. I bet you he got a lot of his ideas from astrology. And in fact, I later found out that Jung did have a big interest in astrology, and I do believe that some of his ideas were drawn from there as well. So in the late 1920s, Jung met Olga Freeby-Kapteyn, a theosophist, who lived in Ascona, Switzerland, and also had a lakeside home on Lake Maggiore on the border of Switzerland and Italy. And she came to Theosophy primarily, her influence was Alice Bailey. In 1928, Carl Jung suggested that Olga turn part of the large farmhouse on her property into an east-west conference center. And Olga did so and created the Uranos Foundation. And here are some pictures I found on the internet of Olga and Carl Jung. Between 1921 and 1937, to let you know, Jung was traveling throughout England, the United States, Africa, and India. And while in India, Jung said that he avoided a meeting with Ramana Maharshi because he admitted he did not understand Ramana's concepts of self-realization. Jung also admitted that the field of psychology seemed incompetent to understand the Eastern insight of the Atman, or the self. So let's look a little bit more at Olga. As I mentioned, she came to Theosophy primarily as a student of Alice Bailey. And they knew each other quite some time, but in the spring of 1931, Olga asked Alice Bailey to come and join her in the endeavor of the Uranos Foundation. And so for 3 summers, Alice and her family lived with Olga there in Ascona, Switzerland, where Alice interacted with others and also gave talks. And it was here that Alice met Dr. Roberto Assagioli, as did Olga. Here is Olga. Here is Alice. And here is Roberto Assagioli there in Ascona, Switzerland on Olga's property. And it was through the meetings and interactions of the Uranos Foundation that Alice Bailey and Carl Jung became aware of each other's work, though they never personally met. Now, Bailey acknowledges that Jung's work was important in her books Education in the New Age and From Intellect to Intuition. But Jung had trouble with Bailey and the notion of masters, feeling Bailey's Tibetan master was not real but simply her higher self. Bailey refutes this in her unfinished autobiography, saying that if she ever meets Jung in person, she will ask him how it is that her higher self is able to send her parcels in the mail. However, Olga seems to have eventually joined with Jung in his belief that the Tibetan was not real, and she and Alice Bailey parted ways, and Olga began to delve more into the study of archetypes. Since we brought him up in the previous slide, let's look at Roberto Saggioli, born February 27, 1888 to August 23, 1974. He was the founder of psychosynthesis, and he pioneered humanistic and transpersonal psychologies. We're now into the spiritual psychologies again. Though Saggioli was very guarded about his personal life, we do know he was born in Venice, Italy, and was of Jewish descent. His father died when he was only 2, but his mother remarried shortly after. I found this interesting, so I put it in here. By age 18, he could speak 8 languages. And he had 1 wife, and he was actually a very stable man and happily married for 40 years. Saggioli had degrees in neurology and psychiatry and moved to Switzerland when graduating from university. At this time, he met Carl Jung, and he trained in psychoanalysis. Freud and Saggioli were known to have corresponded, although they never had the chance to meet. Regarding Freud and Jung, Saggioli wrote that he wanted to, quote, pay far more attention to the higher unconscious and to the development of the transpersonal self, end of quote. He was, quote, not against psychoanalysis or even behavior modification, but insists that the needs for meaning, for higher values, for a spiritual life are as real as biological or social needs, end of quote. As we already saw, in 1931 he met Alice Bailey, and he actually became her most significant and productive student. The spiritual instructions to Saggioli from Alice Bailey's Tibetan are found in her Discipleship in the New Age books. Now, Saggioli's theories for what he would later call psychosynthesis were greatly influenced by Bailey, though he had begun to outline his ideas as early as 1911. And throughout his life, he mostly hid his true connection with Theosophy and Bailey, though most people know of the connection now. In 1940, he was arrested by Mussolini because he was praying and working for peace. Imagine that. He was put into solitary confinement for 27 days, which for him became a profoundly spiritual and meditative experience. Saggioli accredited much of his inspiration for psychosynthesis to this month-long incarceration in solitary confinement, using his time to meditate and investigate his inner life. His approach of psychosynthesis focused on the artistic, altruistic, and heroic potentials of the human being, and he shared with Jung the belief that psychological symptoms can be triggered by spiritual dynamics. And for those of us who live in Ojai, since this talk is in Ojai, I should mention that he was instrumental for his involvement in establishing Meditation Mount in 1971. That's because in his letters he was encouraged to do something more with will, so he wrote his book, The Act of Will, and also with the 6 laws and principles which the Mount utilizes. Saggioli continued his work on psychosynthesis right up to his death. So I want to take a look at something. Here's Freud's model that Saggioli had been exposed to, and then he met Bailey and got exposed to her model, and eventually he came up with his own model. If you notice, it has 3 tiers in that egg, the yellow dotted line. So you kind of see Freud's model there, id, ego, superego. But Saggioli is doing something more here. He's doing something with Carl Jung's unconscious, giving a lower unconscious, a middle unconscious, a collective unconscious, a higher unconscious. In other words, he's trying to kind of integrate some of these theosophical levels into his famous egg diagram model. So let's pause for a moment and summarize. So we have HPB, who was the co-founder of Theosophy, directly influencing William James, the father of psychology, who called his approach evolutionary psychology. We have HPB influencing Annie Besant, who in turn influenced Alice Bailey, who came up with esoteric psychology. who influenced Olga Kapteyn, who Bailey also influenced Assagioli, who came up with psychosynthesis. We have Olga Kapteyn as the link between Carl Jung and Alice Bailey. There's that yellow line of that indirect link. We have Carl Jung influenced by Sigmund Freud, who created psychoanalysis, who influenced Carl Jung's analytical psychology, and Jung and Freud both influenced Roberto Assagioli with the psychosynthesis, another indirect connection to Theosophy with the yellow line. And finally, we have Adler and Rank over to the right with Adler's individual psychology, Rank's Be Here Now, and out in left field, I couldn't resist that, is William Wundt and his experimental psychology with the behaviorist and the pharmacologist. Now I want to look at Abraham Maslow. April 1st, 1908 to June 8th, 1970. And he was the founder of humanistic psychology and the co-founder of transpersonal psychology, and we saw that Assagioli had some influence here as well. After getting a graduate degree at the University of Wisconsin in psychology with a focus in experimental behaviorism in 1931, experimental behaviorism is Wundt and Watson and the other atheist Skinner. Maslow went to Columbia University to study under Alfred Adler. Adler was influenced by Freud, and there we have Columbia and Harvard again is really significant in shaping the field of psychology. After World War II, however, Maslow began to doubt the theories he'd been exposed to in psychology because the horrors of the war led him to want to focus on the positive qualities in people as opposed to treating them as, his words, a bag of symptoms. And notice he shared that drive with Assagioli, also wanting to find the positive qualities. So Maslow began his groundbreaking studies of finding and interviewing what he called self-actualized human beings, and this research led him to develop the field of humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology was looking at what healthy human behavior, not pathological human behavior, looks like. With others, Maslow started the human potential movement, and from Maslow's work came the concepts that we now use a lot, hierarchy of needs and peak experiences. Maslow helped found the Journal of Humanistic Psychology in 1961 and attended the first meeting of the Association for Humanistic Psychology in 1963. Maslow suffered a severe heart attack and died at the age of 62 in Menlo Park, California. Now, here we have three models. Freud's to the left, id, ego, superego. There's James in the middle, William James, material self, social self, pure ego, soul, and spiritual self, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where he's taking 5 different levels of development based upon if certain needs are fulfilled, then you can self-actualize. Just to let you know, when I got my bachelor's, and started it in the late 1970s at Michigan State University, there was a professor who was teaching this new field of humanistic psychology, and he literally had over 800 students in his classes. It was that popular, which just let me know that people like me were hungry for what healthy human behavior looked like. So now let's look more at the field of transpersonal psychology, which we saw Maslow and Assagioli had a hand in, but the main person behind it was Stanislav Grof, born July 1st, 1931, and is still alive. Grof was influenced by William James, Otto Rank, and Abraham Maslow. And Grof became interested in mystical and altered state experiences, attempting to understand if they represented a breakdown, which he called a spiritual emergency, or a breakthrough, which he called a spiritual emergence in human psycho-spiritual development. And you see the similarity there with William James's varieties of religious experiences. Grof was active at Esalen in the 1960s, so was Maslow as part of the human potential movement. Esalen is in California. And along with Abraham Maslow and Anthony Sutich, Grof started the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology in 1969 and founded the International Transpersonal Psychology Association in 1973. And now I'm going to bring up 2 men that I happen to know. I got to actually work under them. We'll start with the middle, James Fadiman, who was influenced by William James, Otto Rank, Abraham Maslow, Roberto Saggioli, and so was Robert Fraser, influenced by those same people. And Robert and James are kind of like brothers from different mothers. And together, they helped establish the Association of Transpersonal Psychology in 1972, a year before Groff did the international version. And in 1975, Robert Fraser and James Fadiman established the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which is now called Sophia University. James Fadiman received his PhD from Stanford, and he was actually one of the first people to experience LSD. I had a chance to be in a class where he shared about this. He and other fellow students were actually guinea pigs experimenting with this substance. But that experience was profound and had a big impact on James Fadiman, and it motivated him to connect with Stanislav Grof to try and understand and deepen his knowledge of these kinds of mystical experiences. He later became a Sufi, which moves me over to Robert Fraser, who earned his PhD at Harvard. There's that university again. And he met Abraham Maslow while he was at Harvard. And again, he was influenced by Saggioli and the others. Robert Fraser became a black belt and received direct training from the founder of Aikido. And he became a Sufi when he met Sheikh Muzaffar Osak. And it was really fascinating to hear him talk about his experiences with these two people, especially in terms of mystical experiences and also Qi. Going back to our tree of influence, we've now kicked Wundt out and the behaviorist and experimental psychologist. We just don't have room for them here. And we've added in the transpersonal psychologist, Jim Fadiman, Robert Fraser, the humanistic psychologist, Abraham Maslow. And you can see that the influence of Theosophy now is pretty heavy here. Now we're going to bring up a man named Jean Gebser, July 26, 1884 to November 22, 1963. I'm not going to say a lot about him, except I found some interesting links while working on this talk. I found out that Gebser, in 1942, joined the Eranos Circle, which Olga Kapteyn set up there in Switzerland. And there, Gebser befriended Carl Jung and also D.T. Suzuki and others. While he was there, he was completing a work that he had created, trying to understand the evolution of human consciousness over time. And after World War II, he traveled to India and did what Carl Jung didn't do. Gebser visited with Ramana Maharshi, and he also met with Sri Aurobindo, who was a philosopher, a yogi, who was trying to integrate or synthesize or create an integral yoga of the different yoga traditions. Now, why I'm bringing Gebser up here is because what Gebser was working on is very similar to Theosophy's root races. We have the 5 root races coming from the Theosophical Society. We have 5 structures of consciousness coming from Gebser. This is how human beings are developing their consciousness over time, and the similarities are uncanny. A coincidence? I can't be sure. I'm also going to mention Don Beck, born 1937 up till now. He actually gave a talk up at Meditation Mount on something that he called spiral dynamics theory, which again is an evolutionary human developmental model, which Beck spent many years developing, adapting the work of his mentor and colleague, Claire Graves. And here we have, interestingly enough, spiral dynamics, kind of going up different levels of human development, and I threw in the Theosophical model as put out by Besant and Ledbetter, just so you can start to see some interesting similarities here. Getting to the end of our talk and up to date, one of the reasons I wanted to bring in Gebser and Beck is because they had an influence on Ken Wilber, who was born January 31st, 1949 to now. Wilber started in the transpersonal psychology field, but now considers himself an integral theorist. He emerged as a major figure in the early transpersonal field, providing more of the intellectual and theoretical groundwork. And his ideas were mainly drawn from Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy, and we know that Huxley often talked to Krishnamurti here in Ojai, and Krishnamurti was very directly connected to Annie Besant and Theosophy. Wilbur also was influenced by Gebser Beck and Sri Aurobindo, who was in India and was a philosopher and a yogi who was trying to come up with an integral yoga, integrating the different systems of yoga and yoga philosophy. Wilbur was influenced by Buddhism and also Vedanta. His first book, The Spectrum of Consciousness, was published by Quest, which is the Theosophical Publishing Company, in 1977, after 20 other publishers turned it down over a period of 4 years. So in a way, Theosophy helped launch Wilbur's career. In 1980, he wrote another book, The Atman Project, and that was followed by a book he co-authored, Transformations of Consciousness, in 1986. He's written dozens of other books since then, including one, Up from Eden, where he's trying to take a lot of Gebser's work to talk about the evolution of human consciousness and spirituality over long periods of time, millions of years. Around 2000, Wilbur shifted out of the transpersonal field and headed into what would later become the integral movement, which went beyond just psychology in Wilbur's attempt to create a theory of everything, a title of one of his books. And integral currently now uses what is known as the A-Qual model. So here's Sri Aurobindo, and here's Aldous Huxley, and here we have to the very left Wilbur's first model. Now, what I want you to notice about it is it looks a lot like Assagioli's egg diagram. You have the transpersonal, the personal, the prepersonal, Assagioli's higher self, the middle conscious self, and the bottom is the lower consciousness or lower self. And Wilbur also in his earlier model had something that looked a lot like levels in Theosophy. Now here's the A-Qual model. And what I want you to see here, what's circled in red, is where he's integrated spiral dynamics and also Gebser's work. And I don't have time to explain this whole model at this time. So now under our tree of influence, we're going to add in Ken Wilber. And I'm just going to let you again get a sense of how he's trying to connect all of this together. And at least for me, that echoes pretty much HPB, who to me kind of looks like the mother of a lot of this that we see on this chart, who was trying to do what Wilbur is doing now, trying to bring together East and West in their understanding of spirit and soul and God. So we've reached the last slide, and on this particular one, what I'm going to do is some honorable mentions of people trying to bring Theosophy and psychology very directly together. And we'll start with Robert Gerard. I don't know how that picture got cut off, but it did. So anyway, that is him at the bottom. And actually, he was putting together integral psychology and wedding it more directly with Theosophy as early as the 1980s. And that is me in a group picture. And yes, that was me in my 20s, and that was my original hair color. For some reason, the longer I stayed in California, the blonder my hair got. And also, just to give myself an honorable mention, I too am continuing to put forward ideas that bring Theosophy and psychology more directly together. Then I want to mention a friend of mine, David Tresemore, and he was influenced heavily by Rudolf Steiner. And he has been putting together anthroposophic psychology, and also Scott Hamilton, who has been putting together psychosophy. You can see the words theosophy and psychology together there. And finally, an honorable mention to Robert Turner, who is a psychiatrist up in the Bay Area. I could not find a picture of him. And I knew him when he was attempting to get into the diagnostic manual of psychological disorders, a V code, which is a minor code, to bring in the idea of spirituality into the psychological diagnostic manual in a way that did not make these kinds of spiritual experiences pathological. So that is the end of our talk, and I thank you so much for your taking the time to be with me.